No. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining Ron and I for the this has caught me so by surprise. Ron's the author of The History of Federal Lands in the United States and the Violence of Faction. If you've been following along with our book series, we thank you so much for doing that. Occasionally, we will deviate and we will talk about relevant topics from time to time and how they review the land issue. And so I was talking around before we got on today, and I asked if we should be, carrying on with the video, if we should talk about this topic that I think is very appropriate for now. And we decided to be able to do this. So currently in Idaho, there is well, first of all, we see our country going to hell. Everybody wants to know what to do. We're starting to grasp onto things that I think are strawmen, if you will, or they're not very well founded, or whatever it is. I think we're fearful and emotional, and I think people are grasping, you know, straws that really might not be too strong of argument. So, the one thing that kind of compelled me to do this was Idaho currently has a bill in their legislature. It's a Senate Bill 1252. It's gaining a lot of traction in the state house. It's gaining a lot of support. I am going to say that it will most likely pass because people are really, really worried about the abuse of the federal government. We know that talking about the militia comes with horrific consequences if you happen to mention anything about what it is. And what I started finding out, though, is when I started going to some of these groups, Ron, like the Lightfoot militias and things. What I had found out, though, is that a lot of people didn't really have an understanding of what the militia is. For example, not only did they seem to lack the history, but they would walk around in army fatigues, and I found that a little interesting. So, Senate Bill 1252 is called the Defend the Guard Act. And I guess before I get into it, I should say, Ron, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom. I'm glad we're going to talk about this issue. We would eventually, I think, got to it in the book, but we're in the part of the book where it's talking about the United States military and the territories, and this is the National Guard. So let's get into it.
Okay, so I'm going to try to go over this briefly. The legislative intent is to follow the principles that guided the writers. That's a very interesting word of our inspired Constitution, embodied in the United States Constitution in the writing of the founders. It sounds like to me what they're trying to do. They used an interesting word, Ron, and I'm hoping that this is kind of what spurred me to talk to you. It says the legislature of Idaho should zealously protect its authority over its own militia to ensure that the mission outlined in Article 4 of the Constitution can be fulfilled. That is 4, right? IV. So that'd be,
Yeah,
but that's so it's very interesting that we're talking about Article 4. And
yeah,
the Section 2 talks about Chapter 23, Title 67, and then talks about defines the defend the guard for the purposes uh, active duty combat means the performing of federal or following services in active federal military participation in the United States. Participation in an armed conflict, performance of a hazardous service related to an armed conflict in a foreign state, or performance on the duty through an instrumentality of war. B, the official declaration of war, which will be great to talk about, means an official declaration of war made by the United States Congress pursuant to Clause 11, Section 8, Article 1 of the United States Constitution. And it basically goes on to be able to defend the bill to that end. So I thought that we would open that up, and I thought, Ron, maybe we should do one that talks about the militia. We should talk about the history of the militia. We should talk about the difference between organized and unorganized, if there is such a thing. We have this idea that everyone is a member of the militia from 18 to whatever it is, 45. And so there's nobody better that at dispelling what we think we know, and comparing it to this federal land issue. So I want to just give it over to you and allow me to just jump in and question you if I get confused.
sure. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand about the United States National Guard is the United States National Guard is the current remnant It's an artifact left over from the military that the territorial government put together. All right. Arthur St. Clair was mandated by Congress to put together a militia, an organized militia. This was not done by the constitutional government. This was done by the territorial government, and the Constitution didn't exist at the time. This was done by the Articles of Confederate Government. Okay, so why is all this important? It's important because the constitutional government right now uh, looks at the National Guards as its creation when it did not create them. The militias, as they exist now, were created by the Northwest Ordinance Territorial Government, not the United States constitutional government. Okay, so this is extremely important to understand this. When you go through the history and you watch this military system operate, it was partially this military system that was fighting against the Nez Perce tribe in the state of Idaho. That military government stayed in Idaho. It is now the Idaho National Guard. That is supposed to be an organized Idaho militia. It's not supposed to be under the federal government's ability to conscript that army to go to war at a moment's notice. It's supposed to be under the authority of a sovereign state. But the issue is, let me show you the issue. And this is why I want people to understand this map.
Oh my gosh.
You got to go. The
I
issue
really
is the
Stefan.
amount of red.
Right.
Okay, because wherever the amount of red is, that's territorial. And if this military system is still attached to the territorial system, then you can kind of say that it's still under territorial management. And if it's under territorial management, then it's under federal management. You see? These are the games that are played by the federal government. They're playing games with us, and they're not telling us certain things because if we know it, we could defeat it, right? It's what you don't know that gets you in trouble with the government.
Hey,
Okay?
can I ask something real quick before we go on? So
Go ahead.
we have a clear understanding of what's going on. So we're not denying at this point that the word militia is important in our history, right?
Right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. It's very
So
important.
so the militia is important. So that being said, what are there so what I'm looking for and it's probably going to make you do an eye roll, and that's cool. But is the difference between the military apparatuses, the National Guard, the State Guard, the militia, and whether the militia is organized and unorganized, if there are such definitions to those. I'm hoping that you can offer us some insight and some clarity on what each one of those actually is before you even go into this red versus white issue. Is that something that you feel like you can do?
Yeah, sure. So
Okay.
the whole issue with the organized, unorganized militia is that um it's a different interpretations on the meaning of the Second Amendment, different interpretations. But to really get the full grasp of what's going on with the United States militia and the National Guard, you have to look at the Revolutionary War. It was the militias in the United States that fought the Revolutionary War against England. And it was understood that the states had these militias, but they were not very well organized. George Washington had a problem with the militias because they wouldn't stand and fight most of the time. They would turn tail and run when it got too tough for them, right? So he had a problem with the militias. So George Washington was always advocating for a trained militia, an organized militia, not an unorganized militia that just turn tail and run because there's just a bunch of rednecks out there drinking beer and taking pot shots at cans. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, we're talking about an organized militia that's trained to fight. Okay, so that's what the whole idea with the Second Amendment was. The application of the Second Amendment was that the states would have their own internal militaristic, organized, and trained militia for their own purposes. That was
Organized.
the whole idea. Now,
Organized.
organized, organized militia, a well regulated militia is an organized militia. The whole idea of regulation in the Constitution is exactly that. It's to organize through rules and regulations to organize something, either a territory, a government, or a militia. That's the whole idea with the Code of Federal Regulations, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, and Article 1, 814. Those are the two regulatory provisions in the United States Constitution. One of them is for the government, the internal constitutional government, to use rules and regulations for itself and its apparatus and its communication between agents, or not agencies at the time, but the communication between branches of government and the regulations and the rules between branches of government, etc. That's 1814. And then rules and regulations governing its property in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. That's the
Okay.
whole idea. Go ahead.
Okay. So going back to Mr. Simpleton here, that's me. So now we've talked about the fact that the militia, understanding the militia is important. We understand now that there are basically two militias. There is an organized militia and there's an unorganized militia. So, so the unorganized militia, obviously, I'm assuming, since you said they're a bunch of ragtags, or I actually said that, but it was a deviation from yours. It's just people that like to drink beer and take pot shots at cans, like myself. So I'm assuming I would be part of the unorganized militia, right? But the organized militia is then what exactly? Are they considered the National Guard? Now, I know that we used to have state guards and they seem to have nationalized that too. It would seem like, is that true?
Well, here's the issue. The Second Amendment allows for a well regulated militia. I mean, has anybody read the Second Amendment lately? Can we
Yes.
do that right now? Can we read
Yes.
the Second Amendment
Yes.
and see exactly what it says?
Yes. Are you reading it or am I reading it?
I'm going to read it right now.
Oh, okay. I was going to say I was pulling my book out.
Here it is. A well regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment is to give the state the ability to have its own internal militaristic defensive force that it can call upon from the citizenry at a moment's notice, just like it did in the Revolutionary War. The Second Amendment was what we learned about having a militia. And like George Washington said, it's like you cannot have an unorganized or unregulated militia because they're not effective. They don't do any good. Like I said, George Washington was not a fan of an unorganized militia. He tried it. It didn't work out. He had to train them, organize them, regulate them.
Okay.
Okay.
So what did we call it? So if we had an organized militia that the Second Amendment talks about, what did we call that? Either before the Constitution, during the Constitution,
We
after the
called it just a
Constitution.
militia. But
That's all we
what
called it.
happened is that the United States land program, the government's land program, utilized that militia that's in the Second Amendment. And the whole idea was to carve these states out, get them into the Union, and then they would have their militia because it was the militia that was there to secure these states and to protect them. So each of the states would have an organized, well regulated, trained militia. That's the National Guard of today.
So was that originally, well, it was probably something before it was the formation of the State Guard, before it was abolished. But can we say, for all intents and purposes, it was the formation of the State Guards then? Or is the State Guard different? Do you know?
I don't even know what you're talking about, State Guard. What
Well,
is
so
that?
the states, in looking at the bit I know about history, it seemed pretty clear to me that states before they had national guards had state guards, and like Idaho used to have a state guard, it was apparently co-opted and federalized and now called the National Guard. So I'm trying to figure out for the good people
Oh,
out there
okay. So
listening,
yeah, so
what
all
the
right.
definition is now. So we have,
It's the
we a
same
national,
entity. It's just been federalized because of the federal. So again, let's go back to the map. What creates this problem? All the red.
right,
All the red. People aren't equating it. It's like, look, if you've got this much red in your state, it gives the federal government a lot of options to do a lot of funky stuff, including federalize your National Guard.
right,
They shouldn't be able to, but the states aren't doing anything to stop them.
right.
Never have. They never have. Right? The states are just as complicit here. I think there's some misconception that the federal government has come into the states and held them at gunpoint and forced them to do all this. No,
Yeah.
the states have been complicit.
Or they're operating well within their vassal state arrangement as the inferior over the superior,
They're
right? Is
very
that
good vassals. They're very, very good vassals. The state of Idaho and all these other red states, very good vassals of the federal government.
right?
Very well trained.
So we can see this. I mean, so how I'm lacking the word. How invasive is the lack of knowledge on this issue? I guess has it been in the past? And what's more is how is it more difficult for us now as a country knowing where we're headed?
Just look at all the red on the map. The lack of knowledge creates all the red. If we knew everything I'm telling you right now in our history, we probably wouldn't have allowed so much red.
Right.
I mean, that's just the reality. The reality is not pretty, and people are going to sit here and poo-poo this and ham and haw and all this. But look, the historical record is it is what it is, and I haven't changed it, nor am I misinterpreting what the documentation clearly says. Clearly, the amount of red that's here allows the federal government a substantial amount of influence over the state apparatus, right? So again, if you look at the state of Idaho here, all the areas in white, if you're only exercising 10th Amendment power in the areas in white, how much resistance are you going to put up when the federal government wants to nationalize or federalize your National Guard or your state guard and turn it into the National Guard,
That's
right?
right. Mhm.
The whole idea of the federal government is it's this you have to understand what it is. It started off as as a confederacy, and then it built this territorial system that's a juggernaut. By the time the Civil War hit, it was a freaking juggernaut, man. Look at what it did. It conquered the rest of the United States militaristically. It fought Mexico here in California and Texas. It fought it fought uh, Spain, American War, kicked the crap out of Spain. Spain was a world power until we got involved. Our Navy decimated them so badly, we just took them out of the whole national empire situation entirely. It was an ass kicking of epic proportions. Okay, we created this military machine that the states by, and of course the states are in a vassal state arrangement. What is Idaho going to do when the federal government says, hey, we're going to nationalize National Guard? And they're going to, oh hell no, we're going to use our 13% 10th Amendment power to stop you.
That's exactly right. So basically, what you're saying, though, is it really doesn't matter what we're calling it. The only reason why we're calling it what we're calling it is to be able to have some place to pinpoint to be able to show how things have changed, right?
That's
So
right.
when we talk about the Second Amendment, and you can talk about the regulated militia, and you had said that, Tom, I mean, the definition was a regulated militia. They didn't call it anything. They didn't call it the State Guard. They didn't call it the National Guard. They didn't
That's right.
call any of that. And what we really need to be looking at is a lot like what your book says. Why do you spend so much time trying to define liberty? Why can't you just start identifying, what the principles of what you're talking about really are? And I think that you've done a really good job doing that. Um, so, um, so I guess one question that other people are probably going to ask then, since they have a better understanding now, hopefully, of what these different things are, is, I believe that in that particular bill, it suggests that the National Guard is not part of the military apparatus.
The whole idea, again, one more time, the whole idea of the government's land program, and we're talking about all this area from here down into Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, the whole Louisiana Purchase into Montana, the Western United States. We're talking about three-fourths of the United States underneath this military program. Okay? Can you imagine the scale? We just look at the size of this program, the scale of it. I mean, what did you think was going to happen when it went, if it went rogue, which it's gone rogue?
Right.
It was. What are you going to do to stop it? We're talking. Look at the history of this machine that we built. Man, it's a devastating weapon. In the wrong hands, oh my God, dude.
And it is. So we can say, so I mean, I could throw an argument out there, and I could be wrong, and that's okay, because it's I'm used to it. So if the bill that is going before our legislature, and I would have to make sure it does, but if it says that it is not part of the military apparatus, I would disagree with that statement. Would you not? If it's under federal control, under the federal land program, then how can it not be?
Well, okay. So I'm trying to figure out how to answer this in the best way possible because a guy can get in a lot of trouble,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Saying the wrong
Beep, beep,
things,
beep,
okay?
beep, beep, beep.
I could tell you the absolute truth, but it's going to be very unpopular with a lot of people, powerful people. So I'm just going to go ahead and say this is what the truth is.
Only if you're comfortable with it, brother.
The If the state of Idaho wants to fall in line with the intention of the federal government's land program and the eventual turning over of the militia to the state, then what they're doing is correct. However, there's going, because of what they're doing and the way that this machine still thinks that it's in control, there's going to be a conflict.
Well, then let's break that down a little bit then, if I'm not deviating from your line of thinking here. Because you threw me off when you said if the state of Idaho wants to be able to get its sovereignty back, is that what you're saying, or exercise its
No, no,
sovereignty?
no, no, no. The state of Idaho, okay, once again, let's look at the state of Idaho. The state of Idaho does not have sovereignty over this.
That's exactly right.
I'm outlining the map here. In fact, let me just roll it down a little bit. This is the geographic boundary of the state of Idaho.
Uh-huh.
We do not have 10th Amendment sovereign power over that whole landmass,
Hmm.
right? Only the areas in white are we sovereign as a sovereign state. So it's not about getting our sovereignty back from the federal government because
Right.
we've
It's
never
not.
had any sovereignty over the red.
Right.
Never.
Hmm.
So we're not getting anything back.
Okay.
The only thing we're going to be able to do with our militia is start a fight with the federal government about who rightfully has possession of that military. If the state of Idaho fights it right, fights it correctly and fights it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they do it right, they make the right arguments, they're going to put a lot of pressure on the government to let go of its federal acquisition of the state militia if they argue it correctly under the Second Amendment and the 10th Amendment. They argue it from those two perspectives, they're going to put a lot of pressure on the federal government and the Supreme Court, because what is the Supreme Court going to do? Say, no, that's not what the 10th Amendment and the Second Amendment say. It won't do that. They're going to say,
Right.
well, you're right, that's what they say, but is it the right thing to do?
Right.
That's what it's going to come down to. Is there a national compelling interest here? And yet, yes, there is. Because how many states have National Guards?
All of them. Yeah.
And this is the remainder, this is an artifact of the
Mhm.
territorial military. Now it's expanded obviously since then. You know that the military that was the territorial military is much bigger now, and it's expanded. We got our own navy and all this stuff and all these military bases and stuff. And so the National Guard is a part of that. And the government still thinks this national military system that we have thinks that the National Guards are part of it because they came from it. It's like, no, in a I can see why the military mind would think that way,
Mhm.
but this isn't fucking military. This is politics.
Right. That's right. So,
And you can't think that way when you're doing politics.
yeah. So if I were to go back and talk about 1215 just for a minute, and it tries to utilize the constitutional provision about a congressional declaration of war, is this bill, number one, just from what I've told you, it looks like it's basically an attempt to try to get back there. Um, do you see that this bill would be helpful if it seems to lack so much history relating to this issue?
Let me ask you this. Would you give a 5-year-old a loaded weapon?
Okay, question answered. Because so I mean, so the average person's going to say, but Ron, we've got the Second Amendment and we've got this congressional declaration of war. We're not supposed to go to war unless the Constitution, unless it fits within the purview of whatever, those provisions are. And what do you say to that?
Well, I would say that because look at the red. Look at the amount of red on the map again. The amount of red here tells me something that we don't have the political maturity in the Western United States to even manage our own territory or our own states, let alone walk around like a 5-year-old with a loaded gun.
Right.
And we're gonna what? Take back the military to what? Operate in 13% of the state?
Yeah.
Let's say we take charge of that military apparatus and National Guard. Where's it gonna operate? And and who exactly is calling the shots there? The guy that can't even get sovereignty in our own state because 61% of it's owned by the federal government, 84 of the political subdivisions are dominated by a federal influence. It's like,
So,
no, man,
so if this
no.
bill, so if this bill passes, it really isn't from what you're telling me, it feels like it's really not going to do much because it doesn't go far enough to address the root cause of the problem. Am I right in that?
Yeah, see, the root cause of the problem isn't so much that the federal government's federalized our National Guard. The issue is we don't have mature enough leadership that thinks independently enough to even free the state of Idaho from federal control.
Because
And it,
you'd have to eliminate this, you'd have to you'd have to restore sovereignty before you could even implement such a bill, would you not?
yeah, I would say so. I would say, look, if you're going to do something like that, I think the first thing you need to do is force the federal government to restart the land program. If you do that, now you give some incentive for the state to have the militia at its disposal when it needs it. Otherwise, What incentive do you have to have the militia at your disposal? You're a vassal of the federal government already. So if you're having a problem, you're not going to solve it on your own. You're going to get federal funding, or you're going to
Mhm.
have the federal military come in and handle the problem. We're a vassal until we start thinking independently and get out of the vassal state uh, mind virus that we're in.
Mhm.
I don't see any reason to not have a federalized National Guard.
So would you go so far as to say, even though we can see now that the bill is short-sighted, rather extremely, I might add, um, would you go so far as taking a position on it either way because for any reason? I mean, there are
Well,
certain, I
I
mean,
think you're putting the cart in front of the horse is what I think. You alluded to that a little bit earlier, and you were
right,
right when thinking that way because if you just understand what the National Guard is, and then you understand, okay, it's an artifact from the territorial military system that was supposed to be left in the state of Idaho, left in Washington, left in Oregon, a portion of that to have their own regulated militia for the state's purposes, under the understanding that the program was going to produce all white.
right.
But it didn't produce all white, did it? It produced all red. So
Mhm.
what happened? Well, we only have 13% of the state, roughly, maybe 20% of the state, with which we have some level of um, exclusive autonomous independence. And what is the per if you only have that much level of independence, what are you protecting? 20% of the landmass of the state? If
Yeah.
you were if you like, I got my cursor hanging over some of these states over here. If you were one of these states that had predominantly white in them, I could see that. I could see having control of your state guard and your well-regulated militia. Why? Well, because that's a lot of white to protect, and your job is to protect the white. If you're the state of Idaho or the state of uh, Iowa or Illinois or any of these states down here, your job is to protect the white. Well, when you got so much red, your job's not to protect the red. The federal government won't let you. They don't want you protecting their red.
Well, and it brings up another, a point, going off on the political side of things is, I've always wondered if we have this sort of vassal state arrangement and we've got a, federal constitution, for example, and we've got all of these things through Article 4 and whatever with the laws or the rules and regulations and things that have followed the creation of the Constitution. Why have state legislatures create bills that do anything to try to regain any of the state control back from the federal government under the same premise? Is it really just, it's really not, it's just the same thing that we're talking about, isn't it?
Again, it's not getting control back. It's we're warping our minds when we start thinking that way because we've never had control. When the land was admitted, when the state of Iowa was admitted into the union, we were given a land grant. It came to roughly around 3 million acres. That's what we were given. Idaho's land mass is 53 million acres. Right now, since then, we've gotten more land. We've acquired more, right, over time. And I would imagine that the acquisition of more land is every time that it's like getting a gold star every time that you do the right thing in school. You get a little gold star on your chart. So every time somebody acquiesces in government and state government acquiesces to federal power, they get a little grant of land here, little grant of land here, scratch there. But the federal government is never going to allow large swaths of its property be handed over to the state for two reasons. Number one, that was never the intention of the program. Number two, they don't want to compete with the state and get the state out of the vassal state arrangement. It wants the state standing there with its hand out saying, I have to have money from you to operate because it maintains that vassal state arrangement, that dependence.
And it's still important for us to remember that we were talking about uh, the, I just forgot what it was, the, the land program versus the ownership principle.
Yeah.
When you have the red, you've got we're staunchly in the camp of the ownership principle where that owner has no interest in giving up what it owns.
That's right. That's exactly right. When it seized possession, and remember, the land program was never predicated on ownership. As you can see, there's white, 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 white. Oh shit, there's red right here. Oh, that's 1976 on. That's what produced this over here.
Right. Wow.
They were already moving that direction, so it slowed down the land program. But from 1976 till now, that's what's kept all this red in a static, you know, this map won't change and hasn't changed probably in 20 years. Right?
Right. So I guess it's important for us now that we kind of understand where we are with this militia issue. And I'm not really happy to hear about this at all because,
Sorry.
well, I'm just not. But hey, truth hurts only if it should, right? Um,
Yeah, well, it's the truth that we need more than anything right now, don't you think?
yeah, well, it kind of is because if you don't really understand the whole truth about what we're dealing with, and we're truly looking for solutions, it's actually going to help us see which people are really interested in real solutions or ones that just want to make people feel like they're gaining solutions. So I'm
Yeah.
looking, I was looking at this bill and of course I had, read your book twice and I keep saying that as a badge of honor. It is. And I'm working with you on these videos and it's great, but I couldn't help myself from contacting you today going, "Hey, we got to cover this issue because this restoring the guard or whatever it's called, defending the guard bill has everything to do with lands and people need to know." So I don't know how many people, how many hands or viewers this video will have, but it should. I'm certainly going to do my bit to be able to get people to understand this. But as we do that, people are going to rightly ask, "Okay, Tom, now that we recognize exactly what the problem is, and Ron is right about this, what is it that we're going to do?" Now, I think you kind of alluded to that earlier, but I need you to clarify that again, if people right now happen to be asking that question.
Well, the first thing we need to do is figure out that people need to watch these videos and go, okay, the red is the problem because it's an indication of the lack of independence of the state. And if the state cannot think independently, then there's nothing to protect. The whole idea of independence, when you have it, is to protect it,
That's right.
right? The whole idea of the Constitution was that the system would protect the private enterprise and the rights of the individual. But it only works if you've got all white, because then the state can do its 10th Amendment job if you got all white. But if you got all red, it can't. So the whole scheme that we began with, completely altered in the Western United States by all the red.
Right.
You
So
can't
then,
apply it.
so then if the problem is this red versus white scenario, what do we do to turn the red white, man?
The only thing that we're going to be able to do is we've got to the ownership principle in FLIPMA, as I said in the last video, it's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional because the land program predates the United States Constitution. And the land program dictated the changes that could be made. That means that in order for the constitutional government to change the disposal program into an ownership program, it would have to have abided by the the exact mechanism laid out in the land program's original legislation. That program's original legislation mandated that any changes to the disposal program would have to be done constitutionally. Those are quotes, air quotes, constitutionally. That's a quote. Well, FLIPMA was not done constitutionally. That's legislation. That's Article 1 power. They passed a piece of legislation that seized ownership of the remainder of the lands. Now, people have said, well, that's a constitutional process. Then I would say, then why didn't the founders put down legislatively and not they put down constitutionally and not legislatively. Oh, you can make changes to the program legislatively is what it should have said, but it
Hmm.
didn't. Are you telling me they didn't understand the difference between constitution and legislation?
No, I'm pretty sure they understood the difference. They even openly said that amendments to the Constitution shouldn't even be done. Um, uh, they shouldn't even be done by amendment if they could be done through legislation. So
There are
that was
people out there
another
that are
example
just
of that.
not very smart. Okay, so if you understand that the disposal program is written into the Constitution in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, and you say, okay, if I'm going to make a change to the program, what is the mechanism that I have to do that? Well, don't you think you'd have to alter the disposal mandate in the Constitution before you did it? That's why the land program legislation said constitutionally made. Why? Because the disposal mandate was written into the Constitution.
Right.
It's not a ownership mandate, it is a disposal mandate.
And forgive me for asking this, or maybe my brain is just too full, but what is would it be the I don't want to say termination of the Northwest Ordinance, but there are specific acts or bills or legislation that would need to be challenged, right? Did I
The
say that
what
right?
you would have to do is you would have to challenge FLIPMA, the ownership principle in FLIPMA, all the way to the Supreme Court and get the Supreme Court to say and agree, yes, when the government passed FLIPMA and added the ownership principle, it didn't do it correctly.
And if SCOTUS did this by some miracle, what would that mean
It wouldn't
after
be a
that?
miracle. It just takes somebody with the time, the money, and the courage to do it. The Supreme Court's going to go, look, the dude's
Right?
right.
Yeah.
The paperwork says that the legislation is not a constitutional alteration. It is a legislative alteration. So therefore, under the terms of the original legislation that created the land program, you can't do it. They would jettison the ownership principle. That would be our best shot at restarting the disposal program, and that's what we're going to have to do to turn the red white.
Okay. So what would so let's say SCOTUS decides that, they hear the case, they rule on the case, it's in our favor. What does that look like for the rest of the nation at that point?
Well, I mean,
Or Idaho or the red
do
states
you
or
remember in '76 when FLIPMA was being discussed? It was heated. I mean, it was, it was heated, man. Talk about a heated moment in our history. '76, man. '74 to '76 when they were first, considering seizing ownership. You're gonna have a worse moment now because the division in the United States is so profound that we're going to be at each other's throats over this. But
yeah,
if we don't do it, we're sunk anyway.
we're sunk anyway.
So
Okay. Good. Well, I think this was a great topic. I think it was important for us to be able to nail this in the head right now, even while legislation is happening. I have another issue with somebody else that's talking about property rights, but I'm almost thinking I should probably do these topics separate so that if somebody sees an issue or wants an issue, especially dealing with this guard issue or the military issue, that we don't ever start covering other topics. So I think I'd rather just keep it to a topic if that's okay with you. Ron, I don't think there's anything more that I have to ask. Is there anything more that you feel like you have to add before we terminate the video?
yeah, I lost you there. I didn't hear everything you just said. Somebody, I was using my phone for a hotspot, right? So
All
that
right.
I could do this video, and somebody tried calling in. I went and bought an actual hotspot thing. I need to get it set up for
Oh,
our
okay.
next interview.
No,
But
I didn't really have anything else because I figured that I probably beat this thing with as many sticks as I had. Were there any final comments that you had
no, I mean,
had before we terminated
Again,
the video?
the history of the United States militia is very, very important for us to understand because it morphed. It everyone's gonna, and they have this policy in the conservative circles in the United States, and it needs to go away. And this policy is that there's no correlation between the establishment of these National Guards and the militaristic system in the territories. It's like it's just not true. That military that was over here in the state of Idaho chasing Chief Joseph through the up here in the United States and into Montana and all over the place. That military, that remainder residual military, was left behind in the state of Idaho when Idaho was granted statehood as its well regulated militia. That's not going to be accepted by people. They're going to go, "You're full of crap." It's like, well, prove me wrong.
Well,
Prove me
it's
wrong.
kind of it's kind of funny because I've talked to our attorney. I don't want to call him old attorney general because he's not, but Lawrence Wasden, very interesting character. He has definitely given me food for thought and given me the ability to be able to see things in a different perspective. And we got into a conversation one time about the 10th Amendment. And you know what he said? And
What?
God bless him. After what I've been listening to you, I'm like, he was right. He basically said that he doesn't necessarily believe in the 10th Amendment. And I and so and the way that he went about saying it wasn't that he didn't believe in the 10th Amendment. He just, these are very pragmatic individuals. They deal with things the way they are. They're not looking at things from a sort of altruistic perspective, like, oh, God gave us our rights and all these different things. I mean, he's looking at law for what it is. And I find
Yeah.
it very interesting that his position is actually the same as yours. Basically, he could have basically said, and he might even, is why would I support the 10th Amendment when we don't have the authority because we're all red? I mean, he could have said that.
Right.
And the other thing
Well,
to
yeah.
consider too is that is that is the feds, number one, they have a problem with states advocating for the militias because they've gotten a really a bad rap. Um, and the governor doesn't even acknowledge the unorganized, even though they don't say it because people don't know that there's any difference between the two. But the governor won't even acknowledge the militia as anything other than a nationalized apparatus that operates locally and wherever they want them to go. I was always interested in the fact that the national, I'm like, wait a minute, from everything I read, the National Guard is not supposed to be going overseas. They're not supposed, thus the word National Guard, like protecting the nation. It's like, why are we in North Korea? Why are we in Panama? Why are we in all of these other places? Why is the federal government allowing this? Why are the states going along with it? And what happens when we have National Guards of every single state going down to the southern border or worse, going to Ukraine or going to all of this? I mean, those are the questions that I'm coming up with.
You can see, and this is what I'm trying to get everybody to understand, that system, these militaries, these National Guards, these state guards, these are just the artifact remnants left over from the federal government's territorial military program that created 3/4 of the United States. And when you understand the scale of this thing, you'll understand what Wasden's talking about.
So that brings up another question then. So if I can say this, if the National Guards are all state, there's National Guards in every state. Do you know if there are any specific lawful areas that they're supposed to be working, or are they just under the federal, whatever you call it, exclusive
Well,
jurisdiction,
let's
if you
use the
will?
state of Idaho for an example. Let's just get into your example for a minute. Do you know the areas where the Idaho National Guard operates? You have any idea?
I just assumed it would be around the state borders.
The Idaho National Guard, you got the Gowan Field, you got the
Yep.
Mountain Home Air Force Base, you got it various other places. Well, let's just look at the Mountain Home Air Force Base. Okay. They got a training range out there. That's all federal
My
land.
federal land.
Anytime, anytime. and this just came up, and I've worked on these military bases. I know a lot about them, okay?
Mhm.
Anytime they need more rangeland to run their tanks and for training, they just take it. It's all federal land. And when the government operates there militaristically, it's exclusive for sure.
Mhm.
Meaning nobody is going to exercise a right in there except for the federal government. Period. Period. There's no 10th Amendment power in there. There's no private rights in there.
Private rights. Mhm.
There's only the United States military. Let's look at Gowan Field. Because because Gowan Field is a military base, it is also exclusive. It's an enclave. It's a federal enclave. It's exclusive jurisdiction there. I know they I've been on Gowan Field multiple times doing work. I understand how they operate there. You get in a little, situation in Gowan Field, dude, they don't have to worry about having probable cause to pull your ass over.
Right. Yeah, or they don't.
They need to
That's
throw
good.
you into who's gal, your ass is going.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's funny because I don't see state badges or anything in any of those areas. So, that
They're
exclusive
under
thing,
exclusive military power
they
there,
are. Yep.
and and there's no state power being exercised there
Mhm.
because it's all red, man. It's all red.
So we should
So
we should
whoever,
go ahead.
go ahead.
No,
No, I was just
go
gonna
ahead.
say one more time.
Yeah.
Whoever, the color dictates the power.
Right.
Let's one more time. The color
Co-
dictates the power.
Right. Got it. Okay. So we have to go back probably and offer vindications where necessary. Some people could say, well, what's that guy's name? Arthur Sinclair? What a tyrant. How can he do this? And we could say that, but we could say, well, you might not want to say that so fast because he was actually put in a position for a particular purpose. Isn't that right?
That's right. So you can look at it as a tyrant mechanism. It wasn't intended to be that way,
That's right.
okay? Because understand these were not. There was no constitutional. I don't know how else to say this because to me it's real clear. But you have to understand something. I'm an anomaly, right? So I've been tested from here to the nth degree. By the time I got to high school, I didn't have to take reading, writing, comprehension anymore. I was done, right? I was finished. I was graduated. I should have in college courses when I got to high school, English, writing, and pattern recognition. I'm in the top 20 percentile globally on pattern recognition, reading, writing, comprehension. Okay, so
Well,
I'm
I'm
just a
not.
bit
I'm
of an
not.
anomaly in this area.
That's good.
So
I'm glad to know you, man.
Well, so this I'm just a kid when it comes to those two things, I'm a bit of a freak, right? So I love puzzles. This is why I love doing this, is because it's been probably my largest puzzle, and I've enjoyed every minute of it because I love puzzles, right?
Mhm.
So piecing all this together in my mind and having some level of awareness and understanding of how all this works has helped me to understand the entire freaking system. The United States constitutional system is not well understood. It's
No.
just not.
And we're
Okay.
gonna t
And
and
it's
we're gonna
even worse in the States with all this red.
and I'm trying to, well, maybe I've coerced you already, but we're hoping to be able to get into some of that, maybe the Bill of Rights and a constitution class that'll hands down just beat anything else out there. I just think it would be important for us to be able to understand the constitutional provisions from a land perspective rather than a Hillsdale College class or something else that just says, you know, our founders, granted this and that, and there's no other powers and all that. I think that this is it's such an eye-opening, it's complicated, it's mind-boggling, it's challenging, it's depressing, it's empowering. Um, just knowing something that you didn't know before, really just does something to a guy. So,
Yeah.
I just appreciate having you on here. Ron, anything else?
Well, wanted to get into Dillon Rule and Home Rule, but we're at an hour already, aren't we?
Yeah, we've got, I think we started at 2:15, so it gives us about 14 minutes
Well,
if
let's
you
see
want
what
to.
we can squeak in that time. Okay, so another problem that having all this red creates is it creates a problem with Dillon Rule versus Home Rule. Is one of the things that I wanted to cover today because there's this misunderstanding about Home Rule and what it is. Okay, so when you look up the history of Home Rule, you'll see that it originated in the fight between Ireland and Britain when they were having their tussle between, Ireland wanted some level of independence, so they created this home rule ideology that they could use to try to gain some level of independence away from Britain, right? Well, it migrated over here to the United States, and eventually, in 1970, well, the Home Rule Act was in 1974, I think, when Congress passed the Home Rule Act. So Congress was doing a whole bunch of things at one time. So from the 70s onward, it was engaged in a very slow, systematic series of adoptions of the Home Rule Act, implementations of FLTMA, etc., because they had already figured out they were going to seize ownership of the remainder of the federal land. They just had figured that out. This is what we're going to do. And so they implemented home rule in DC during this time. And then very shortly after that, they passed FLTMA. So this is boom, 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 right? So this is where the federal government, this system, this territorial system, when it gets clicking, boy, it's way ahead of the curve, right? So if it looks at long range plans and it looks out and it says we want to get something accomplished here, we have a goal. And so it'll put all of its brain trust together and they'll start spitting out ideas. And then you'll get like the 2005 legislation that creates the current problem with Lava Ridge. That was back in 2005, man. Right?
Wow.
So these are long range planners and long range thinkers. And we can't even get the people to understand red versus white here. I mean, we're overtasked to a huge degree, and the only thing that I can pull out of the ether as hope is, well, there's a divine component here that you know uh everything is going to go according to a divine way of things going, right? So everything's planned out to some degree that direction. We still have free will, and we have to calculate free will in everything that we do. But okay, so Dillon Rule versus Home Rule. The state of Idaho has passed
Wait,
legislation for this.
do you want to define Dillon Rule or never mind? Go ahead.
Well, here, let's do
Because
that. Let's
you
get
did
into it.
home rule, and that was pretty cool. And then I'd hope maybe you'd do Dillon Rule and then talk about them both together.
So,
If I could
a long
implement.
time ago, a guy named Dillon, a judge, in fact, here it is, Judge Dillon. He issued a ruling on something that's later to become known as Dillon's Rule, and here's the ruling was basically that the state applied its legislative power to all the different political subdivisions under its umbrella. And this was an exercise of his 10th Amendment power. But for local government, anywhere where the state did not legislate, that the local government could pass an ordinance to fulfill some function locally that wasn't covered statutorily from the state. And this was considered Dillon Rule. And it's a little bit deeper than that. It goes a little bit further, right? Because we're dealing with political subdivisions, and we're talking about expansions of political subdivision as far as population, area, and all this stuff. So when you're dealing with states, like one more time, when you're dealing with states over here where you got all of this red, it gets tricky because if you're going to apply the state of Idaho has a Dillon Rule statute, so let's look at that Dillon Rule statute before we go a whole lot further. Let's just look at the statute. Here it is. Title 50, Chapter 3, 301 to be precise. corporate and local self-government powers. Cities governed by this act shall be bodies corporate and politic, may sue and be sued, contract and be contracted with, accept grants in aid and gifts of property, both real and personal, in the name of the city, etc., etc. And it goes on to say, have a common seal, which they may change and alter at pleasure, may erect buildings or structures of any kind needful for the uses or purposes of the city, and exercise all powers and perform all functions of local self-government in city affairs as are not specifically prohibited by or in conflict with the general laws or the Constitution of the state of Idaho. And this was passed in 1967, the year I was born. Okay. Also, there's other statutes in Title 50 that transfers the police power locally. Now, this is important because there are some Dillon Rule situations where the police power doesn't get extended to the political subdivisions, meaning they can't have their own police forces. They can have courts, but not their own police power. That means the state handles all the policing of the political subdivisions.
Oh
So
my
that means that,
gosh. Oh man. Okay.
but in this, but in the state of Idaho, because we've given the police power to the political subdivisions, we have sheriffs in each of these counties and jurisdictions that are elected by the citizens thereof. So you can call it a disaggregated police power that has some level of autonomy, but is guided by statutes of the state. So the state sets the general jurisdictions and powers of the police power that can be exercised by the local political subdivision. Oh yeah. This is called, when it outsources the police power to that political subdivision, this is what we call Dillon Rule Plus. It's not quite home rule because apparently the state still wants statutory power over the political subdivision in the state. But the problem is all the red. That means it can only apply that Dillon Rule power and authority in all the areas in white.
Do you think Judge Dillon knew this?
It's hard, like at the magistrate level, which is this judge was a magistrate judge. At the magistrate level, I don't think that this stuff is very well understood, if even remotely at all understood. Right. As a matter of fact, okay, your level of position in the system affords you a broader view the higher up you go up the ladder. You get a broader view. I'm unique in that because I understand the land component. I have a very, very, very broad point of view over the entire system because I understand the land component. If you understand the land component, you broaden your view of the system by orders of magnitude.
Right.
I feel that way. That's the missing component in most people's minds.
Right.
So we're only applying the Dillon Rule power in the areas in white, the state of Idaho, all the other states as well, right? You can bring up a map and look at the map and find out what's Dillon Rule, what's home rule. If you look up Idaho, you'll find that it's part Dillon Rule, part home rule. Well, here's the problem with that. The state of Idaho has passed no home rule legislation. It's only passed Dillon Rule Plus legislation, and it only operates in the white. So if we're part home rule, part Dillon Rule, how did home rule get into Idaho, and where is it operational?
Oh my gosh. So they're claiming home rule, but there's no legislation authorizing it to be used.
Well, the state of Idaho can't legislate for the areas in red. Doesn't have the authority.
Which means that the local subdivisions can exercise that home rule in their locality, right?
Yeah, so there's a bit of an issue arising here. It's like, well, okay, well, This is William Penley and his discussion on American Moment with those gentlemen. And he is going, look, Idaho, state of Idaho, it's got an 84% problem. That's what this problem is. It's a home rule versus Dillon Rule situation. So let's get into home rule a little bit. Everybody, there are people out there, I've heard them say this, like, well, we prefer to have home rule. I'm like, are you sure? Let's look at it. This is a white paper. It's from American City County Exchange, a very good white paper. And it talks about federalism, Dillon Rule, and home rule. So if we're conservatives and we believe in 10th Amendment power, which one of these systems of local self-government would you want to have? I hear people saying, oh, home rule, home rule. Okay, let's get into this. Local governments across America follow one of two types of government authority, home rule or Dillon Rule. Home rule, as it sounds, gives local governments government authority to make a wide range of legislative decisions. Legislative decisions. Wait, let's stop right there. Wait a minute. That is in the state of Idaho, that's Article 3 power. That means Article 3 power in a home rule scenario is granted to the local politicals. Article 3 power. The state of Idaho, constitutionally, the legislative branch is Article 3. One more time. In the state of Idaho, the legislative branch is Article 3 of the Idaho Constitution. That means under home rule, the local government is exercising Article 3 power.
Just like the Article 3, just like the Article 1 courts, right?
Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? We're starting to make some correlations. Yeah, it's a similar sort of concept here. Okay, so by contrast, the Dillon Rule creates a framework where local governments can only legislate what the state government has decreed. Both forms of governing authority were created by the states to help give blah 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 blah. Let's get down into it a little bit here. The founding fathers of the United States had a clear vision of how they intended government to work using a system of federalism. So what does home rule do? It upsets the federalism principle established by the founders. Why? Because it moves the legislative power out of a centralized location into a non-centralized location, thereby diluting the ability of the state to apply any 10th Amendment power at all.
Wow.
Because let me ask you this, what can apply 10th Amendment power, the state or the local government?
Yeah, the state. The state,
So
right?
if you make everything if you make everything a home rule and you dilute the 10th Amendment power of the state, what have you just done?
Yeah. Yep. Is that on a paper that you wrote, or is
Yes,
that just,
this is a white paper.
can you share that with
I
me
can
so
send it
I
to you.
could, maybe I can,
I will.
if there's a link, I'll share the link. If it's not, then I'll just keep the paper for myself.
Well, there's a link and it goes to a PDF and I downloaded
Okay.
this PDF.
No, that's good. The link's
I've got
perfect.
it on mine.
I can put it in the video. Yeah,
Well, let's
that'll
see
be
if
good.
we can. Yeah, there's a chat box on here, right?
Yep. Somewhere.
Copy that. We'll open up Zoom. And let's see.
And I'll just have to post it anyway. And we're coming up on 3:20, so we started at 2:15, so we're an hour and 5 right now.
Well, there's a lot more to go over to talk about to get into the brass tacks and the details of Dillon Rule, home
Should we
rule.
get
I mean, I
into,
could spend another 3 minutes.
do you think the time would be better spent?
This.
Do you think the time would be better spent if we did a segment just on Dillon Rule and home rule?
Yeah, really.
Because I know
because
I wouldn't mind going on for 3 hours, but the problem is I think that people's attention spans, I don't know how long people are watching the videos in their entirety like they maybe should be or whatever, but I think that getting past an hour, I think can be quite a bit for people. But if you want, let's just do, if you're okay with it, we'll go ahead and give final comments now, and then we can go ahead and do a full thing on the Dillon Rule and home rule next time. That way, well, you don't need to be prepared. but I'd like to be. So I have some questions. So if you're cool with that, let's just
Well, see,
offer some.
this relates to that bill a little bit because if you're and these are my final thoughts on the matter. If your state is a home rule state and it's got legislative power locally and it's dispersed and divided the state's 10th amendment. In fact, the only entity in the constitution that is able to apply or expend or perform or to hold 10th amendment power is the state. Well, the political subdivision is not the state, it is a subdivision of the state. So it doesn't. So this gets really tricky to figure out. Okay, do we have to have this conversation? Do we want the state of Idaho to have 10th Amendment power? That's the central question. Because if we're going to have this Dillon rule versus home rule, militia versus non militia, all this stuff, it centers around this issue: 10th Amendment power or none.
Well, and if we don't have, if you're arguing that because we're red and not white, that we don't necessarily have the use of the 10th Amendment in Idaho as it is, are we saying that the application of home rule makes it worse? I mean, it obviously makes it worse. But
It
that
does.
would sort of eliminate the conversation relating to the state's exercise, the state's use of the 10th Amendment, right?
Here's the situation: if we want to accept our vassal state arrangement forever and just live underneath it, then we go ahead and accept the home rule, accept it, live underneath it, and let the federal government do whatever it wants to do whenever it wants to do it. If we as a body, as a citizenry, we say we're done with this, we want to start exercising some level of control over what happens within our state, then we have to go the other direction. We cannot engage in home rule.
Right. Okay.
It just creates more of a problem for us to have to overcome to get to the other side, you see.
Right. Okay. I totally understand that. Okay. Wow, that was weird. Were you there?
Dude, you bailed
Just
on me,
I
man.
just went off the radar. Oh my
You
God.
just bailed on me. I'm like staring at myself on the screen going, okay, who the hell
That
is
was
this guy?
weird. That was weird. It just kind of jumped back on and there I am. So anyway, I'll let you take it away, man. I'll let you finish her up and then we'll go ahead and end this
Yeah,
thing.
so okay, so I think the next episode, let's get into the brass tacks of home rule, the history of it, how it came to be, how it's being applied. We'll just get into the details of the home rule, Dillon rule situation, and then we're going to need to everybody to watch these and go, okay, well, look, what are we going to expect our government to do?
Right.
We're going to have to make a decision here and quit riding the frickin' fence because the federal government has a plan, it has an agenda, it's going to implement it. And part of that plan and that agenda is to implement home rule in all the red areas of the United States that it can. Why? Because it disperses 10th Amendment power that way.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to doing that. We'll look forward to doing that next time then. Right?
Sounds good.
Okay, brother. All right. Well, Ron, thanks for joining me. Ron, in case you haven't been paying attention, is the author and he's been studying this issue for more than 20 years. He's the author of The History of Federal Lands in the United States and the Violence of Faction. The link to his website is the history of federal lands in the United States .com. And I'll put the link in the video, in the chat in the video. And we're encouraging you to purchase a copy of the book, help support the author. If you would like to contact him, set up an interview, anything like that, go to his contact page. And you can also reach our videos on the vlog page. So, Ron, thanks for joining me, man. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continually visiting with you as we talk about issues and get through the book. So I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tom, and I'll be looking forward to the next one. I think the next one will be a barn burner, but thanks for having
Awesome.
me and have a good day.
Okay, brother.
All right.